Okay, everybody, welcome back to the podcast for a very special evening episode. We're going to have a very lively discussion and debate. I'm sure it's going to be an extremely fruitful exchange between two friends of mine, returning guests to the podcast, Dr. Brian Besong and Jimmy Akin. And we're going to talk about the ethics of lying. Is it ever okay to lie? And this is going to be a really exciting subject because people have requested it. This is something that has been um, on the audience's mind for us to cover. And can't think of a better way to do it than have two great minds come on and see what we can hash out. Two, not just great Catholics, but two Catholic converts, in fact. So what I'd like to do, and we are going to try and be efficient with our time here. So if each of you wouldn't mind, just maybe provide a brief introduction of who you are and what you do. And then from there, I'll have sort of Brian outline his theory of lying, Jimmy outline his, and then we're just going to get right into an exchange. And if we have some time for Q&A at the end, we will certainly try and entertain some of that. So Brian, why don't we begin with you? Quick, brief background, and then we'll turn to Jimmy.
Okay, so I'm currently an associate professor of philosophy at St. Francis University in Loretto, Pennsylvania. And as you mentioned, I'm a Catholic convert. I converted in 2008, or was confirmed in 2008. I was raised Baptist and Presbyterian. And my main research is on moral knowledge, as well as natural law, classical natural law, moral theory.
All right, excellent. So it sounds like you're just the kind of guy for this type of conversation. And Jimmy, friend, certainly a good friend of this podcast. I think this is maybe your fourth or fifth time on at this point, but give us a quick reminder of who you are and what you do.
Okay, so I'm the senior apologist at Catholic Answers in San Diego. Our website is Catholic.com. Next year will be my 30th anniversary working professionally for Catholic Answers as an apologist. And so I've logged a lot of miles in that regard. And as you mentioned, I'm a convert from evangelicalism. I became Catholic in 1992. And if people want to read my conversion story, it's at my website, jimmyakin.com. I'm also well known for tackling my background also is in philosophy. I'm known for tackling a lot of different subjects, and a bunch of people may be familiar with me from one of my podcasts, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at both natural and supernatural mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason.
Yeah, I can't recommend that podcast highly enough. It's one of the few that I tried to listen to on an actual regular basis. It's just so much fun. And in fact, it's somewhat related to how this conversation came about, because you were on our friend Michael Lofton's channel talking about Star Trek theology. So I'm like, of course I have to listen to this. And that's where it came up, lying came up, and you kind of outlined your theory of lying. And it immediately struck me, this would be a perfect thing to have a conversation and discussion around. So here we are. That was the genesis of that. Okay, let's get right to the action then. So Brian, we're going to have you go first because you take sort of the more traditional perspective on this. So if you wouldn't mind, give us the nuts and bolts of your theory of lying. You just, spoiler alert, you hold it. It's never okay to lie. That's the position Brian's taking. So yeah, please go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's right. So natural law moral theory makes the assertion that that actions are good insofar as they help us attain to human flourishing, the particular end of the human life, which is happiness. And so it adds to that claim, the claim that human happiness consists in the satisfaction of our natural appetites. And so actions are good insofar as they satisfy our natural appetites in the right circumstances and for the right intention. And actions are bad insofar as they frustrate our appetites. And an appetite's frustrated when the power that's invoked or used in the appetite is used away from its end and towards some other end. So each power constitutive of an appetite has a built-in structure. That structure naturally aims at the good end involved in the power. And so when the power is used well, it's used towards its end in the natural way built into the power to attain its end. So that's a broad theory, and it has a lot of implications. I enjoyed the theory. Philosophically, I find it quite satisfying for a large number of reasons. It's quite cohesive. One of the implications that is controversial, well, there's a few that are controversial, but obviously the one relevant today is in terms of communication. So the natural appetite to communicate is aimed at the good of revealing one's mind At least this is one assertion, and we can defend or talk about why that would be the good. But that good means that every time we communicate, we have to communicate in such a way that we are approaching the end of communicating our minds. What does it mean to communicate our mind? It means to reveal our attitudes, including various cognitive attitudes about the way the world is, attitudes about our hopes and preferences, our assertions, that is a particular speech act of asserting, should always be in conformity with our mind. And so a lie would be a deliberate assertion of something that goes against our mind. Now, this is a slightly different way of using the word lie than sometimes you'll hear in ordinary conversation. Sometimes if somebody makes a mistake, they'll correct themselves by saying, oops, I lied, and they'll correct themselves. A lie always involves not a mistake, but an intentionally miscommunicated, or it's not necessarily intended. Well, the idea is that you should communicate your own thoughts. Deception may sometimes be allowable, but lying is never allowable, principally because it would always frustrate an appetite. There's a secondary reason why lying is wrong, and that is that other people, because knowledge is relevant to their pursuit of happiness, other people have a right to know what pertains to their pursuit of happiness. And so on the one hand, it's always frustrating an appetite to lie, the appetite to communicate. On the other hand, it's also often violating someone else's right to know. Sometimes deceiving someone, that is, speaking in broadly true ways, but in ways that they misunderstand, can be permitted insofar as they do not have a right to know other than how they've been deceived. And so there's a sort of twofold way in which lying is typically wrong. And so we could talk about natural law more broadly, but that's how it comes into this debate.
Okay, excellent. Good little summary statement. And then, Jimmy, if you wouldn't mind, could you give us your theory of lying? Mm-hmm.
So my theory of lying is one that that is just the product of my own philosophical reflection. I don't have prior thinkers that I appeal to I recognize elements of my theory in prior thinkers. I want to make it clear that, though, that I'm a loyal Catholic, and so I submit to the magisterium and its teachings. But on this subject, the magisterium has not yet defined a position, and there's a range of different theories open to Catholic moral theologians and philosophers to try to figure out this issue. And that being the case, I've done my own reflection to try to figure it out, what seems to make sense to me in terms of how we best account for all the data. And I've shared my theory with others. And like I said, I'm not wedded to this theory. I'm wedded to the magisterium. But this is the theory that I find most helpful in thinking this through from a philosophical perspective. And I've shared it with some other folks, including theologians, including moral theologians. And thus far, when I've done that, they've said, you should publish this. I've even had a Thomist, and they typically take the no lying at all position. And even the Thomist theologian I spoke to said, you should publish this. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But in essence, my theory is that when you lie to someone and when you deceive someone in any form, you are doing damage to that person. Specifically, you're doing damage to their belief system. And so if we want a fancy philosophical term, something that's connected with belief is referred to as doxastic. So this would be, you're doing doxastic damage to them rather than physical damage to them. But once you think about it in those terms, I think the issue of when it would be okay to deceive someone becomes much clearer. Because there are situations in doing physical damage to someone where it is perfectly legitimate to do that. Killing in self-defense is the classic example, but there are many others, including things that are not life-threatening. Like if I need to set someone's broken bone to help them out, well, that can involve doing some damage. If they've got a partial fracture, I may need to, if I'm a physician, I may need to go ahead and complete that fracture in order to be able to get all the parts together so that they can heal properly. On the other hand, there are forms of physical damage that are never, ever permitted, like killing an innocent non-aggressor. If someone is not an aggressor, I can never deliberately kill that person. And so that's an intrinsically evil form of physical damage. And I would say the same kinds of things apply to, and we can get more into the details, but I would say the same kinds of things apply in doing doxastic damage to someone. That if, just like it's okay to kill in self-defense or in the defense of innocent life, proxy self-defense, the same thing is true of lying. So yeah, I would say if the Nazis come to your door and say, do you know where any Jews are? And in fact, you do know where Jews are, and maybe you're hiding them in your attic, you can lie to them. You can damage those Nazis' belief systems and trick them, deceive them into thinking that there are no Jews in your attic or that you don't know where any are. On the other hand, there are other things which would be intrinsically immoral to do doxastic damage to a person with, such as telling them, I am not a Christian, Jesus is not God. Because there is and Jesus makes it clear in Scripture that if we deny him, he will deny us. And I think that that under no circumstances could you deny your Christian identity. You could not lie about that, and you could not teach heresy or speak heresy in a way to lead people to believe it, because of the situation involved there. I would view that as being intrinsically evil, just like I would view killing an innocent non-aggressor as being intrinsically evil. So what I find is this damage-based approach, with its analogy to doing physical damage, is able to account for a wide range of our intuitions regarding when it's okay to lie and when it's not okay to lie, and that also allows for some things to be intrinsically evil, while other acts of deception to be morally legitimate. So that's an overall sketch.
Excellent. Cool. Brian, I'm going to let you kind of maybe ask a kickoff question here in just a minute, but let me get one in first. Because I don't think we're going to focus much at all on the magisterium here, because I think we're all in agreement with what you just said there, Jimmy. But let me ask you, just for my own curiosity, you recently had a debate on old and young Earth creationism, and you said, yeah, you could be a good Catholic and believe in a young Earth. The magisterium hasn't definitively come down on this, but it does seem to be leaning in a particular direction. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's the case here? Even if the magisterium hasn't come down, do you think it has leaned towards a position on this issue?
So based on my reading of the historical trajectory, I think the magisterium, I mean, originally you had, in the early church, you had a bunch of different views. And the Augustinian tradition became dominant in the Middle Ages, and it was picked up by St. Thomas Aquinas. And so as his boat rose, so did the fortunes of his theory of lying. So in the early 20th century, for example, you had not an exclusion of non-Thomistic perspectives, but a special form of magisterial promotion of Thomistic perspectives. And so I would say the magisterium was leaning towards his theory of lying at that time without excluding others. But then following the mid-20th century, that magisterial approach to St. Thomas became obsolete. And so even though he's still highly respected, he's still a doctor of the church, you don't have the magisterium promoting St. Thomas's views over other thinkers the way you did. And also I think the events of the 20th century, like World War II and the Nazis at your door example, which the church had to confront, because, I mean, you had Pius XII running a spy ring out of the Vatican, and that intrinsically involves deception. There were Jews being hidden, people connected with the church were lying. There were reports of issuing false baptismal certificates to let Jews pass as Christians. And so I think the horrors of 20th century European warfare forced the Vatican to rethink some of this stuff and be more open to non-traditional approaches, non-Thomistic approaches. And I think sort of the high watermark for that was the original 1992 edition of the Catechism, where it appeared to endorse a non-Thomistic view. And so even though there had been multiple positions that were possible, for the first time, it looked like you had a magisterial endorsement of a non-Thomistic one. And then they walked that back because it was pointed out behind the scenes, hey, do you really want to move away in a visible public way from the historical majority view? And John Paul II concluded, no, on second thought, we don't want to do that. So they just removed a particular clause from the catechism. And the purpose of doing that was not to settle this question, but was to return it to the historical status quo. And the catechism's statement on this is best understood as providing basic catechetical instruction, lying bad, without settling every technical question possible. And those are still left open to theologians. So I would say that the magisterium has leaned different ways over time, and currently they're sort of taking a neutral approach to this question, and they're letting moral theologians and philosophers kick this around.
Okay, excellent. Yeah,
would you agree, Brian? Does that sound fair to you?
Yeah, that sounds right. And I think it's maybe worth adding, Jimmy, you may get this reference. I would think that because the view has not been settled definitively, that if a person were in a situation where compulsively not knowing definitively one way or the other, whether it was okay or always impermissible to lie, if they lied, considering the relative epistemic probability that lying could be permissible, I don't think that they would sin. Now, it's a tricky issue whether in debates like this, if there are multiple views, someone can take a more permissive view. My view is that that would be a permissible act insofar as they are ignorant of what they ought to be doing. Or put differently, it is an intrinsically wrong act for which they're not culpable, given the unclarity of this issue.
Yeah. I'm glad you made that qualification, because I would say that if the Thomistic theory is true, then it is objectively wrong to lie, but
Yes.
you wouldn't be culpable for it necessarily.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Hey, that's a great point of clarification right there. So let's dive in a little bit deeper now. Brian, why don't we start with you? Now that Jimmy's theory is on the table, I guess we'll let you probe into it a little bit, and then we can switch it around the other direction if we want. Like I said, I know you guys know how to have adult conversations. So I'm going to be pretty hands off. Maybe I'll ask.
Hey, we're going to keep this family friendly, right?
Right. That's true. Yes.
Okay.
Important qualification. Yeah. So go ahead, Brian.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Jimmy. And I love doxastic damage. I think that's a great, nice little catchy way of describing the theory. So, and I've got a lot of respect for your thoughts. So, one of the things that I find most compelling is not just that natural law gets us nearly always the answers that make a lot of sense, but it's also a cohesive theory. It's not patched together with, as it were, duct tape and super glue. It gives one set of principles that explain every action that's explainable. And so one of the things that's always struck me about alternative views that soften or qualify or take away some of the explanatory power of natural law, is that when pressed, I always find that they kind of, they don't feel like they're cohesive. They feel ad hoc. They feel put together off the cuff. And so, I don't know, Jimmy, if you watched the debate between Janet Smith and Father Gregory Pine on
and your critique of Janet Smith, yes.
Oh, okay. Well, great. So one of the things that I just find dissatisfying is the alternative theory's inadequacy to explain the gamut of intuitions we have. So I guess one way of getting into that is just by asking some simple questions about what sorts of lies your theory says are okay and which are not. I was just teaching healthcare ethics today, and I was talking about placebos. So there's There's a case where it seems like you're doing some damage on the arm in order to help the body. Uh, let's imagine a case, and just to be clear, uh, I do think deception is sometimes permissible, but just not lying. And you might think of that as a distinction without a difference. I see a big important difference there.
Yeah, and we can come back to that because that is something we should talk about. But
Okay.
go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so let's imagine you're the doctor and you tell them this pill will cure you, and it's Pez in a gelatin cap, or it's just powdered sugar in a gelatin cap.
Mhm.
Often it does cure them. It does great work. Is this the sort of doxastic damage that would be permissible?
In principle, I haven't thought about that specific example in detail, but in principle, I could see how that could be a reasonable form of doxastic damage. Just like I could finish breaking someone's bone in order to be able to reset their arm and help their health overall. So I could see how the theory could accommodate it in that way. There are also other ways of handling the placebo issue, though. First of all, we don't know what is responsible for the placebo effect.
Right.
It could be a purely naturalistic thing that goes on in the body. If you have confidence in your health, then you may trigger some healing reflex. There are also people in the parapsychological community who are analyzing it in terms of, is this a form of parapsychological healing that people are doing on themselves? We really don't know. We don't have an explanation for the placebo effect. We just know it works. And so it's usable. And there's been a question of, well, how can we reasonably use it? And actually, pharmacists are confronted with this problem because they don't keep sugar pills in stock. People always talk about placebo as if it's a sugar pill, but really it's never a sugar pill. What a doctor will do is he will take some drug that is not going to hurt the patient and then find a sub-therapeutic dose. So it's too small a dose to actually treat any condition or harm the person. It's too small to harm the person, which is what they're really going for here. And they'll write the person a prescription because that's part of the medical ritual that you need to have the person have confidence in that this will really work. And then the person takes it down to the pharmacy and says, I want to fill this prescription. And the pharmacist looks at it and realizes this is a placebo. And so what is the pharmacist supposed to do? And the standard, or some of the standard language that pharmacists have developed for handling this problem is because, when they give it to the patient, it's going to say in the medical literature what this is really for. I mean, what this drug really treats, what its on-label treatments are. And they have to give that information to the patient. So they fill the prescription, they give them, let's say it says that it's an anti-anxiety medicine, but the doctor is using it as a placebo for some other condition. Well, the pharmacist will say, okay, so this is normally used to treat anxiety, but your doctor believes that in your case, this dosage of this medicine will help your condition. And that's a true statement. The doctor is betting on the placebo actually working. And he's not committing to saying it's going to work because of its intrinsic properties. And a doctor can use similar language in prescribing such medication to someone. Now, that would not be a lie on classical theory, but it is arguably an act of deception. And I would say it depends in part on how astute the patient is in picking up on placebo language. But it looks like it's a form of broad mental reservation, which is a kind of deception, but for purposes of helping the person out. And so I would say on my theory that it could potentially be justified, a justifiable form of deception.
What about Santa Claus?
I am not a fan of Santa Claus.
Me neither, obviously.
Yeah. I think that there would be ways of incorporating Santa Claus into a Christmas celebration in a family, but if I had kids, and I would strongly, in conversation with my wife, of course, urge us, because you can't avoid Santa Claus in our culture. And kids will feel cheated if you say, oh, well, we just don't do Santa Claus here. So my approach would be to say, yeah, we can talk about Santa Claus, but he's just pretend. And so we can enjoy Santa Claus movies and animations. We can watch the Rankin Bass stuff from back when I was growing up. We can go talk to Santa at the mall if we want. You know, we can do all that stuff, but we know in our household, this is just pretend.
That seems reasonable. And so I'm curious how much your view of doxastic damage. So one way that I can construct this in my mind is a very similar to the early modern natural lawyer Hugo Grotius, who defended a view that lying is permissible in cases where the person lied to has no right to know. And so it's a purely social way of accounting for lying. As Catholics, this is a particularly difficult area because of the strong connection between lying and contraception. And so, but we'll put that aside for just a moment. I'm curious if you share this view, because here's one reason to think that they're the same view described differently. You can only hurt people who have limited their right not to be hurt. Rights have limits, and so insofar as a person is innocent, their rights are inviolable. They can't be violated, at least not intentionally. When you, however, act against another person, you limit your right, say, to bodily integrity or health or autonomy. And so putting someone in jail would violate their right to autonomy, except that they've limited that right to autonomy by acting against others in unjust ways. Or the right not to get punched in the nose if, they're doing something bad and that's the only way to stop them. Their right to get punched in the nose has been forfeited. Now there's an idea there that you should use proportionality in your violence. And I think that idea would come across in your theory too. But I guess it seems to me that the best explanation for who and when, who we can damage and when we can damage them and how much we can damage them is going to be subservient to the best theory of natural rights, which seems to make the doxastic damage view similar or identical to, or at least quite close to Grotius's view. And I'm curious if I'm misunderstanding or if that seems right to you.
So in terms of my approach to it, I don't use rights analysis as the first layer of analysis in approaching the question of would a lie be okay? Because I don't think we have a good theory of who has a right to know what. I think that's an enormously tangled question. Now, I don't deny that or when they would have limited their right. So I don't altogether reject the right to know analysis, but I don't find it helpful. I think that that at some deeper level, if I were to elaborate this theory in great depth and consider a whole bunch of different questions, at some point I'm sure it would intersect with rights, because people do have rights. There's just a question of, is that the most helpful analytical tool for every question? And I don't think it is. And I don't think it is in this case, because I don't think we have good intuitions about who has a right to know what and how they might limit their own right. And so I don't find that helpful. What I tend to do instead of rights analysis, because there's more than one way to approach a moral question. You can also think in terms of virtue, and in a specifically Christian context, you can think in terms of love, because love is God's number one priority. That's fundamentally what God wants from us. He wants us to love him and love our neighbor. And on those two commandments hinges the whole law. And so I tend to approach it in terms of what's the most loving thing to do in this situation? What will best promote the good of the other person? Now, at some point, that can get us into rights territory, but I don't think starting out the gate in terms of rights is the most helpful analysis on this question, just like I don't think it's the most helpful analysis on most moral questions. On most moral questions, we shouldn't instantly think, ooh, do they have a right to that? And as if that's the only criterion. No, we should think, what's the loving thing to do in this situation? And if we're violating one of their rights, well, then we're being unloving, unless they've restricted their own right. But love is the primary analytical tool that I prefer.
And I'll say where we have common ground here, I don't think that we have great intuitions about rights either. Alistair McIntyre famously dismissed rights as like witches and unicorns. I think he's totally wrong there, but I think what motivated him was that in Western liberal societies, rights claims are ubiquitous on everything, and they've become almost a parody of themselves. So
yeah,
I'm with you there, and I understand his motivation. And so I wouldn't say that we should appeal to intuitions about rights. I think we should appeal to the best theory of rights. And why I might be less inclined to appeal to what's loving is I feel like our intuitions on what's loving are even more vexed than our intuitions about rights. And so I'm going to use an example here that connects up natural law theories of lying to contraception. It's a problem. Let's imagine that a person in Central Africa is married and they contract AIDS through no fault of their own. Let's also imagine that they're about 25 and they have strong pangs of concupiscence that make it extremely difficult to live in a celibate or continent form. So this person is beset by constant concupiscence and finds life unbearably difficult without the satisfaction of the marital debt. I think that a lot of people's intuitions here are that the loving thing is to use contraception and to satisfy
specifically a condom, because that's the only kind of contraception that's going to work in this case.
Yeah, you're right. So that my gut, obviously I don't share that intuition, but my instinct is to say that intuitions for most ordinary people are almost like this is a no-brainer, and anyone who would say otherwise is in the grip of a theory. So I lay that out there because I think that there's a strong conceptual connection in natural law between lying, where you're using a power away from its end, and the sexual act. And so as Catholics, you know, that this is a well-defined area where we can't be using condoms, even though it would satisfy concupiscence.
Actually, that's not as certain as you're presenting it. And I know this comes as a shock to a lot of people because in our conservative Catholic circles, we are firm on trying to promote the church's teaching on contraception. The problem is most of us have not done a careful look at the history of magisterial teaching on this subject. I mean, they may have looked at Casti Connubii, they've looked at Humanae Generis, Humanae Vitae, but they haven't read that or subsequent documents carefully. And it actually, and I hate to say this because it's such a lightning rod issue, but if you go back and look for it, there's a history of situations in which magisterial support has been given, at least tentatively, to certain proposals among non-married couples for using contraception. The famous one, which is somewhat murky in its historical details, is the Ugandan Nuns. The claim is that back in the 1960s, there was a very violent situation in Uganda, or maybe Congo, I forget, and nuns were in danger of being raped and impregnated against their will, and there was a consultation that with some moral theologians, and Paul VI tacitly gave his blessing to the idea that that these nuns in danger of being raped and impregnated could use contraception as a way of self-defense against involuntary violent impregnation. Similarly, you have, go ahead.
Sorry, my eyebrows interrupted. It seems like that's going to be a little bit different case. Well, it's going to be a socially different case because you're not intending contraception.
Correct. And the argument is going to be in the case of an AIDS, using a condom to deal with the transmission of AIDS, the contraceptive effect is not the end either. What you're trying to do is stop the virus, and the stopping of semen is simply a foreseen consequence of this, but it is not either a means or an end. So the law of double effect could, in principle, apply here. And you have support for some version of a thought like this from Benedict XVI. Because in his interview book, towards the end of his pontificate with Peter Sewald, he was asked about, suppose you've got a prostitute, could this prostitute infected with AIDS, could this prostitute use a condom in order to prevent the transmission of AIDS? And he replied, and subsequently the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith provided a theological note on the situation in which they said that the position that the Holy Father was advocating was that the use of a condom in this situation could diminish the evil being done here, in that it limits the transmission of a dangerous disease that could kill you. So it does limit the evil being done by limiting that specific evil, but the evil of prostitution remains fully intact.
This seems like counseling the lesser evil.
Well, he didn't counsel it. He just said it would, in fact, be a lesser evil than having prostitution sex without a condom when you know you're infected with AIDS. So my point is that that it's very easy for people in our theological waters to overestimate the circumstances and the firmness with which the magisterium has addressed various issues in connection with contraception. What the church has taught very firmly is that, and this is Humanae Vitae, is that between married couples, any use of a contraceptive action before, during, or after the marital act is intrinsically wrong. That's what the church has said. It has not addressed peripheral questions like the ones like the one that you just posed. So I would say that that someone could say to you, well, you're in the grip of a theory, and that's driving your answer on the use of, could you use a condom to block AIDS? And even your own Pope Benedict XVI was open to using a condom to block AIDS. That doesn't mean you should be doing prostitution, but there was openness there in a way that you're not showing openness, so you are theory ridden.
Well, yeah, I guess one thing to say is that softness on particular issues can sometimes be a result of caution that the church often exercises in areas like this. And so what we're looking for are definitive teachings to the whole church, rather than decisions, especially decisions by individual popes for local circumstances. Because, and I feel like you might be able to even say more about what constitutes an official teaching of the church.
I wrote a book on it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So none of these seem to comprise or to satisfy conditions for teaching the church. They seem to rise to the level of consideration without rising to the level of theory reconstruction or important qualifications to Humanae Vitae.
Yeah, well, Humanae Vitae is actually much much more restricted in what it actually says than most people realize. It really deals with the question of contraception between married people, and it doesn't deal with contraception outside of that circumstance. And I don't want to go, because I don't want to. That's a whole separate debate.
Yeah, I understand.
And so I don't want to get too far down that road. But since you brought it up, I don't find using a condom to stop AIDS particularly helpful as an analogy for analyzing a fundamental theory of lying, because that situation itself is open to significant question when you know the magisterial history of this.
Oh, just on the theological side, though, you know, and that's an important qualification, is if we're looking, if we have to suspend judgment about, you know, what natural reason tells us, and we have to rely exclusively on what the church has told us, then we might be a little bit more in the fog. And so one of the things that I would say is that, philosophically speaking, there's a lot going for simple theories. Other things being equal, simplicity is good.
Yeah.
And it's commonly a deciding factor in a theory. And so here's a very straightforward philosophical theory of lying and sexual ethics. Both should be aimed at the end of the power. So communication.
And that this is what I wanted to come back to. I agree with your fundamental natural law approach, your initial discussion of we should act in such a way as to use our faculties towards their proper ends, and the proper end of human life is happiness and so forth. Where I would disagree is that the only function of in language you used, is that the only function of speech or communication is to express our mind. I don't buy that. That certainly is a function.
Use it. We can use it in myriad ways.
Yes.
The question is, what is the good of it? What is its natural end?
Yeah, and I don't think a simplistic analysis that says manifesting our mind is its ultimate end. I think that that's too narrow a framing of what the faculty of communication does for us.
Okay, so I mean, what's a good alternative there?
Well, I don't approach it on those terms. I would have to think about the role of communication, but I wouldn't exclude deception from that. If there are situations in which it's legitimate to deceive someone, using communication to do that would then potentially be legitimate. Let's perhaps step back and look at another concrete example. So suppose, and I've been letting you probe me for a while, so I'm going to probe you a little bit.
Sure.
So according to your theory, as I understand it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, suppose we're in a particular thought experiment, and this is not a practical thought experiment because no thought experiment is. It's the point.
I'm a philosopher. I love this stuff.
Yeah. So suppose a person comes to my house, and someone I know, a friend, and says, "You've got to take me in. I'm being pursued. My brother is having a psychotic break, and he's trying to kill me, and you've got to take me in." And so I take him in, and then the brother shows up. And the brother, let's say he's some master workout artist with kettlebells, and there's no way that I could physically take him on or intimidate him or anything. And in this thought experiment, I have two options. I can lie to the brother and tell him that his brother is not here, or I can whip out my 9mm and kill him. And those are the only two options I have in this thought experiment. Well, on your theory, it would seem to me that I do not have the ability, and no mental reservation is going to work. The only two options are lying or killing. They're both forms of damage. To my mind, damaging his belief structure about whether his brother is here or not is a lesser form of damage than killing him. And therefore, on my theory, where we should do the least damage possible in order to be loving, the loving thing to do would be to tell him his brother is not here and let him go off and cool down, or get the authorities involved so they can trank him and help deal with his psychotic break. But if the only two options I've got are lie to this guy or kill this guy, I think lying to this guy is the correct solution because it does the least damage
And if I
in
shared
this situation.
if I shared your view that lying had an intrinsically social character, that its morality depended on not the individual that's doing the lie, but on the social character of the lie, then I would see it as in a very similar light. It's going to do less damage. He's going to have a false belief. One would think that's damaging because true beliefs are conducive to human satisfaction.
That's why it's damaging, but it's in general, just like having your arm set after it's been broken is going to be painful. That's damaging, but your nociceptor nerves are going off, but nevertheless, it's moving you towards a better situation.
Yeah, so I agree. If it were a matter of damage, it does seem like it would be less damage to have a false belief than to die.
About where your brother is.
Yeah, right. I mean, it just seems like a benign false belief. If we're just talking about like how much the worse off is he with a benign false belief, not that much worse off. Which is one of the reasons why a view that has deception allowable is going to make sense in terms of damage, because allowing a false belief is often quite harmless. Allowing a false belief on another person.
People would drive themselves crazy with scrupulosity if they tried to correct every false belief everybody has. I mean, just people would spend all their life on the internet alone because there are so many false beliefs that need to be corrected on the internet.
Right. Yeah. So in terms of benign false beliefs, I mean, there's often benign false beliefs that I think are totally harmless and in fact could be even beneficial in some instrumentally beneficial ways. So I'm with you there.
So I can keep pump faking in basketball. Sorry, I had to make one comment.
That's a sports ball reference, isn't it?
Yeah, which I know nothing about, which just makes it doubly ironic. Yeah.
But I guess the question is whether the means to attain to that is going to be okay. And so if there's...
And that's where I think we have a substantive disagreement because from my point of view, the obvious thing to do in the scenario I just described is lie to this guy, don't kill him. That's clearly, and I think for the vast majority of people, that's the just tell him his brother isn't here is clearly the right thing to do. And my theory accounts for that. So what I also think in conjunction with my theory is I don't really find the act of lying to be reasonably distinguishable from the act of deception. Because if I think about it now, actually historically people have tried to analyze lying in terms of speech. It's a speech act where you knowingly deceive someone. And well, that is one form of lying, but it doesn't have to be speech. If I write you a letter and I lie in the letter, well, that's still a lie, even though it's not speech. It's communication though.
Communication.
But yeah, it's communication. But there are other forms of lying too. In the Catechism, it says the way it defines lying, it includes not only communicative acts, but any action you do to lead someone into a false belief deliberately. And the definition the Catechism uses, since it includes not just communicative acts, but any acts you do, it is broad enough that it's going to make lying and deception the same thing, which I am fine with for a reason I'll get to in just a second. But just so people could imagine what we're talking about, if we're talking about an act that is non-communicative, where I'm not speaking or writing or whatever, if I plant false evidence on a crime scene to frame somebody, that's an act of deception. It is not communicative unless I'm, writing the evidence or something. But if I just plant false evidence on a crime scene, that's an act that would be a deceptive act that would fall under the Catechism's definition of lying. It's not what we normally think of as lying, but it would count as that. And go ahead.
So what I would say is here the catechism is not going to be our best source for the church's teaching. It's a good summary, but it doesn't have the sort of doctrinal weight that the background papal documents would have, the documents from the church fathers. And
No, not the church fathers.
Collectively.
There's a whole issue there too.
But these are matters of importance. They didn't speak in unison on this, but what I'm saying is it's going to kick the can to
even when they speak in unison, there's an issue.
Okay.
Because it turns out that the unanimous consent of the fathers passage from Trent, which everyone reads as if it's a doctrinal statement, is not. It's a disciplinary statement regulating what kinds of conversations and what kinds of positions could be advocated at the time under canon law.
Okay.
I don't know of a magisterial definition of lying other than the one offered in the catechism, and
but
appealing to prior
where we go to figure out the.
And I'm sympathetic to the catechism is not the end all on this, but I'm not aware of a prior definition of lying that is taught in operative magisterial documents other than the catechism.
My point is only that the catechism has relatively low weight in settling matters like this. So if the catechism spoke loosely, it's to theologians and philosophers to take the loose language and tighten it up into something.
And I agree.
Significant.
And I agree. And whether you want to call it lying or not, I think that the definition of any act that deliberately leads a person into a false belief, or in other words, deception, is the relevant moral issue here. Because if you've deceived me, you've done harm to me, and I don't care how you did it. I don't care if you did it by speaking a falsehood or writing a falsehood. Let's say, there's a change in the lighting.
Sorry, I was too still.
Yeah, no problem. I don't care how you deceived me. What I'm mad about is the fact you deceived me, whether you did it by telling me a lie or using a broad mental reservation or using a narrow mental reservation or putting it in writing or planting false evidence that would mislead me. I don't care about the means you used to deceive me. I care about the fact that you deceived me. And from my perspective, as the person who's been wronged by being deceived, all of this hand-wringing about, was it technically false, or was it an acceptable broad mental reservation, no, it's all deception. And that's the important thing. And the rest of this, to speak a bit boldly on the subject, from my perspective as the victim of deception, the rest of this wrangling about did you technically lie with your words or not is a bunch of hooey. It's irrelevant. The fact is you deceived me, and don't go into this kind of self-justification about, well, technically I didn't say anything wrong. The point is you deceived me, and that's the morally relevant consideration here.
Okay,
that's
so
how I would present it somewhat forcefully.
Well,
a lot on the table there. So Brian, why don't you unpack some of it from your perspective?
I mean, the emotion seemed to be really around the wronging of lying. But earlier it seemed like you had said it would be perfectly acceptable to lie, that is to wrong or to harm someone,
to damage
person. Well, a lot of the emotions seem to be around the victim. You use the word victim
of deception,
of deception or a lie, of this doxastic damage. A victim has been wronged unless they have, some sort of guilt that allows them to be wronged in this way, like to get punched in the brain or to be punched in the nose. But earlier you had said that sometimes it was for a person's best interest to be lied to, like a placebo.
Yeah. So
it doesn't seem like those emotions fit your actual application of the view.
Well, previously we'd been talking about situations in which lying would be acceptable or deception would be acceptable. I was just to emphasize the problem with deception itself as opposed to the means of deception. I was assuming a case where the deception was not justified. or at least where the victim of the deception does not believe it to be justified. But there are situations in which the target of the deception may be totally fine with it after he understands what's going on. Let's say I'm the homicidal kettlebell brother, and my pharmacist gave me the wrong pills, and so I've been off my meds without realizing it, and that's what drove me into a homicidal rage. And then after the authorities tackle me and give me the right medication, I'm no longer in a homicidal rage. What would I do if you've lied to me in telling me that my brother was not at your house when I was trying to kill him, and your only other alternative was to kill me? I would come to you and say, thank you so much, because now that I'm in my right mind, I'm so glad my brother is not dead, and I'm so glad I'm not dead either. Thank you for telling me that lie and deceiving me.
Let me think about an alternative case here, because thinking about all of that hypothetically, if that's going in favor of your theory of lying, then it seems like we could run a parallel case for a lie that you don't think is justified. So here's the parallel case. You are an ancient Roman devotee of one of the gods, eager to make sure that Christians do not rile these gods against your kingdom by worshiping the false Christian god. And so,
or at least the inferior Christian god, yeah. Because they wouldn't deny that the Christian God exists. I mean, he's the God of the Jews.
So you don't want to rile up
Apollo and Jove and
Okay, so you want to make sure that they sacrifice to Apollo for fear that Apollo will take vengeance on your kingdom. And so
this is what motivated Augustine's City of God.
So you demand that they sacrifice to Apollo, and they lie, saying, "Oh, I already did it. Man, that's like this is the 5th time today I've done it." And so you think, "Oh, well, okay, off you go." Now you think to yourself, "Well, kingdom come. It's Judgment Day. It's the general judgment," and they find out all of what's happened, and they say, "Thank God I am not guilty of killing a Christian. Thank you for lying to me, because I am now guilty of one fewer very serious crimes, and I might still go to hell, but I'm going to go to a lesser degree of suffering. I really appreciate that lie." So it seems like there again, whether someone's a Christian or not, it seems like a benign form of doxastic damage that's actually to their benefit.
So I would respond along 2 fronts. The first one is there's more than 2 parties involved in this deception. It's not just me, the Roman official, and the Christian who lies to me. There's also God. And so it's not just my interests or the Christian's interests that are at stake. The interests of the true God are at stake here too. And God has made it clear to us that we cannot lie as Christians in this circumstance. And the question would then be, well, why? Was that what you were going to ask?
Yeah.
Yeah. So here I don't have a single answer. I see that there are several possible ways of answering this. One way is to propose that in order to have ultimate happiness, one must be in union with God because he is the source of all happiness. And so truths that are connected directly with salvation and being with God for all eternity, you can propose, as I did at the beginning, that they are a privileged class where we enter into territory that falsifying those truths is intrinsically wrong.
But you have to give me an
explanation. Can never be done.
Intrinsically wrong.
I'm sorry?
You'd have to give. I mean, it behooves you now to give an explanation of why those would be intrinsically wrong, why they're privileged, why that's not just an ad hoc.
Because they're contrary to the fundamental destiny of man and the fundamental good of every man is being with God.
But why would
therefore the communicative faculty could not be used to deceive a person about his fundamental destiny, his fundamental end, just like married couples cannot thwart the purpose of marriage by using contraception.
So what you're saying is truths of faith cannot be lied on.
That would be a first pass approximate answer I would propose. Yes. Now there is a second approach that occurs to me that doesn't root this in intrinsic evil. Instead, it would root it in positive divine law. And it's just God has said, look, you do this, you're going to go to hell. And he makes that as a decree for us, not because it's required by fundamental morality, but because he's created that as an obligation of positive law. And this gets us into, I'll only touch on it briefly, but it gets us into an area where I think a lot of contemporary natural law theorists are, well, I believe in natural law and our ability to deduce moral truths from natural law. I think that many natural law theorists these days are at risk of overestimating what you can do with natural law, because it seems that they will argue in such a way that every ethical question can be settled in natural law terms without input from divine positive law. And I don't think you can do that, because I think divine positive law, meaning, for people who may not be aware, positive law means law that comes from the legislator rather than some deeper principle. So like here in the United States, we drive on one side of the road as a matter of positive law rather than the other side of the road. And in the same way, there is real divine positive law, like get baptized, or get confirmed, or things like that.
A lawyer would appeal to the natural law principle to respect authority, and that's the underlying principle. So every exercise of legitimate authority is following from natural law.
They do intersect, yes, but that doesn't mean you can deduce every ethical conclusion from natural law without positive law input.
But I don't think any natural lawyer worth their salt would say otherwise. Like, I mean, you can't just say derived from reason, so don't listen to your mom.
Yeah.
You gotta still listen to mom.
Well, and this law, and this can be an example of that. Even if it were not intrinsically wrong to deny the faith, we have an obligation to, a natural law obligation to respect legitimate authority. God's a legitimate authority. He tells us you're going to go to hell if you do this. Then he can bind us gravely to not deny the faith, the same way the church can bind us gravely not to miss mass on this day of the year, or not to refrain from fasting on this day of the year.
One qualification, though, is that every legitimate exercise of authority, the laws that are given by that have to bind in reason. So, and it seems like the God, the just lawgiver, would never give a law that is a positive law or precept without it binding in reason, that is, having a sufficient explanation. And so here the theory seems to punt that God has said so, and that's true, but I could give an explanation, and that explanation seems very theoretically important, not just to satisfy us philosophically, but also to make sense of the justness of God's commands. And here's the explanation: that's a truth of such global significance that everyone has a right to know it, and also lying is always wrong, especially at things of such gravity. So there's an explanation that seems really simple, and God's positive command there makes total sense.
Yeah, and I would. So you brought up a third point, which I had in mind, which was that this particular question could also be answered from a right to know, with a right to know analysis. That everyone has a right to know the truth about the true God, and to phrase it a little more concisely, everyone has a right to know the gospel. That doesn't mean you got to shove it down their throat, but it does mean you can't deny the gospel. And so I'm open to a rights analysis there as well. So I think there are several different lines. Now, if I was writing a book on this subject, which I'm not at the moment, I would need to refine all this and perhaps choose among these different responses. But I think, as we've just illustrated, there are at least 3 responses there that I could use on the doxastic damage model of lying that would still say, I can't, as a Christian, lie to the Roman official about this matter.
Right. Now, and this is all really important, because I think once you start buttoning down the hatch and getting the principles to line up, interesting things follow. So let's say we do the first 2 approaches. The first 2 approaches seem to involve some level of ad hoc justification. So God just gives us the principle without explanation. But that seems rather ad hoc and not fitting God's justice. I'm not forgetting the first line of explanation that you gave me.
Yeah. We've been proceeding at such a pace, I haven't had a chance to take mental notes with the firmness I would want. But I don't know how much further I want to go down this particular line of inquiry. I think that I've demonstrated that my theory can propose several different ways of handling this question that end up with the correct result.
Fair enough.
Whether you buy one or more of them or any of them is a separate question.
Yeah, but as a theoretical proposal, and again, I didn't take good mental notes either, but I pressed you, and then we got to the divine command theory version. So anyone who wants to rewind and rewatch, my thought is the first and the second approach involves some level of ad hocness or arbitrariness.
And
now,
it might.
can it get us the result? Yeah, it can get us a result, but theoretically, when you've got arbitrariness built into your theory, it's always a defect. The third view of the right to know is a well-known, well-trodden theory of when lying is acceptable, with lots of well-known problems. Like, look, if I walked up to someone in the grocery store and said Justin Bieber and I are BFFs, they have no right to know otherwise, and so what I've done is not impermissible.
Yeah, and okay, so let's turn this around, because I don't use rights theory as my primary line of analysis, but I recognize that because people have rights, there are going to be situations in which rights analysis becomes relevant to this question. It seems to me that even though you and I agree that we don't in general have good intuitions about who has a right to know what, you would agree that there are situations in which someone does have a right to know something. And the gospel of all things is one of those.
Definitely.
So I don't think that that attacking or highlighting the poorness of our intuitions on this subject is going to do damage to my proposal in this situation, because knowing the gospel is a clear right.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that you can't get the right results on the issues that matter. The question is, now we have to evaluate what theory got us those results. And if one theory feels like it's put together with duct tape and super glue, it's not going to be as good a theory as one that seems.
Okay, so let's talk about that. I have sympathy for the idea that we want a single set of axioms that will allow us to derive everything else. That's great. That's the theory of everything. Love to have that. Problem is, every time that's been tried historically, it ends up not explaining all of the data. And it turns out reality is lumpy. And if you try to deduce everything from first principles, you are going to fail. You're going to end up fudging data. And if we want to be responsible, now I'm not doubting there is some ultimate set of axioms that we could use to explain everything, but we're going to have to wait till heaven to find out. But every time, whether it's in science or whether it's in philosophy or whatever other area, every time somebody has tried to come up with a single small set of axioms that can explain everything, they invariably fail. And my conclusion from that is that we have to be open to some degree of patchiness. I mean, right now in physics, the 2 major theories, they're the 2 most successful theories of all time, the theory of relativity and the theory of quantum mechanics. Relativity deals with the very big and the very fast. Quantum mechanics deals with the very small. Both of these theories explain more of the data than more reliably than any other theory in history. And yet we know that there are cases where these two theories do not fit together, which is why we don't have a theory of everything. Well, and this is something you talked about in your critique of Janet Smith. Every theory has some difficult cases, and that goes for the Thomistic perspective on lying as well. And so it's simply true that nobody has a theory of lying that we look at and go, oh, obviously this explains everything, because not in a way that's consistent with our moral intuitions.
Okay.
And so I understand and appreciate, and I'll shut up in just a second, but I understand and appreciate your desire for a simple theoretic system that we can use. That's a laudable goal, but I wouldn't diss systems that aren't currently formulatable in such terms. I actually think my theory comes pretty darn close to being a very simple, intuitive way of approaching this subject that explains loads of our moral intuitions.
Okay, so just the listeners may or may not be familiar with a philosophical view that it doesn't have a lot of currency in non-philosophical circles, but it's Jonathan Dancy's particularism. And so a particularist is someone who doesn't think that there are general moral principles that explain anything, really. We can inductively generalize these things are generally okay, these are not, but really it's about particulars. This was okay and that was not. So one of the things that you're saying can kind of be taken by Dancy style particularists and spun, and I want to push against that. So very briefly,
how so?
So it seems like what you're saying is every theory that's cohesive fails. And now a particular says, yeah, that's because all we're doing is generalizing from.
That's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm saying that every theory that tries with a small number of axioms to explain all of the relevant data is all of the data that we need to take into account invariably fails. And that is true when it comes to lying. So I'm not saying anything about cohesiveness. I'm saying something about comprehensiveness. And I'm essentially stating the same thing that you did in a different way in your critique of Janet Smith, that there are cases on lying where our moral intuitions are in some circumstance or other are contrary to the principles of a given theory of lying that we're applying to them.
And I would accept that. Like, I mean, look, as somebody who has, as it were, to live the principles that I articulate, I know there's difficult moral choices. And sometimes our intuitions, and I think our intuitions are the least reliable when it comes to emotionally driven cases. That is to say, cases where there's a lot on the line emotionally. So cases that involve sexual ethics, traditional sexual ethics for most students are their intuitions about sexual ethics are so loaded with the desire to satisfy themselves.
Yeah,
I would really unreliable.
I think that emotion is not the right term here, because there is such a thing as righteous indignation that is not self-interested.
Sure, no,
I would refine what you said to say that our intuitions are bad when self-interest is involved.
Not that simple. It's more like we have to suddenly be quite suspicious, or rather we have to be quite cautious as soon as our emotions get kicked in. We have to be quite cautious about whether we're sort of getting, sometimes this is called in the literature on intuitions, cognitive penetration. So are there background things that are driving our intuitions that we should be aware of? So for instance, a parent may never have the intuition that her son is doing heroin because there's this cognitive penetration in the background that just makes her completely incapable of seeing him in that light. And
yeah,
so
like the mother of the underwear bomber after 9/11 could not admit her son was the underwear bomber, and even he's like saying, my mom is a woman and she's a mother and she loves me, but yes, I did this.
So I'm not saying that our intuitions are totally unreliable.
Maybe that was the sneaker bomber.
There is a range of intuitions that we have to be very, very cautious about, because we already know how we are as human thinkers, that we can get background emotions driving our intuitions. And so I would say that there's a range of cases like sexual ethics or lying in these really difficult, life-threatening decision-making situations where a lot of emotions are in the background. And so there, I think it behooves us to take a step back and not to reject those intuitions out of hand, but to treat them with a higher degree of epistemic reliability, to not treat them like the intuitions we have say that it's always wrong to punch a baby. Those are ones where if the emotions are coming in, they're coming in after the recognition of the injustice of the act.
Yeah, and I don't disagree. Our intuitions are the starting point, but not the ending point for this. And so we need to start with our intuitions about any subject, not just moral theology.
Agreed. Yeah,
but
totally.
and then engage in a process of reasoned reflection to try to purify and elevate and extend our intuitions.
Yeah. Let me, if you don't mind, just maybe try and summarize. I put a few things out. It's been awesome just to let you two guys go. I knew you would find your way around this conversation beautifully.
And I apologize to any listeners if we've gotten a bit technical at certain points, because when you get two philosophers talking to each other, it's hard to stay at ground level.
Yeah, listeners of this channel, they'll appreciate that. So let me see if I can summarize, I guess, the concerns from both angles, and then either of you can correct me. Jimmy, your concern is, given the traditional perspective, you're gonna run into these hard cases where it seems like intuitions don't just clash, but we're getting the wrong result in terms of intuition, right?
Correct.
Is that fair? Right.
Well, there's always the possibility of getting the wrong result in terms of intuition. My concern is that although I'm submissive to the magisterium and what it may say in the future, I think the Thomistic theory of lying will lead to the wrong conclusion in many examples, in many instances that people are actually faced with, as well as in many instances where very important values like innocent life are on the line.
Okay, so I want to come back to that, but that's kind of your primary concern, right? And that really is the primary concern, I think, when it comes to the traditional natural law perspective, right?
And I'm sure that Brian's concern is exactly the same about mine, that it's going to lead to the wrong results.
Yeah, wrong results. And Brian also seems to be concerned that there's sort of arbitrariness is the general concern, right? Arbitrary breaks, and maybe if you not just that the theory might have an unacceptable degree of ad hocness, but if you start to have breaks in one area, are we going to get undesirable breaks in other areas, which is again sort of the traditional Thomistic, right? These are kind of
and those are legitimate concerns to have in principle, but I don't think that Brian has a basis on our discussion today of accusing me of those things.
Well, it's not fully worked out, and so I'm just trying to push and see what comes.
Right. And that's fine. But then to say, oh, Jimmy proposed this ad hoc theory that's not fully fleshed out. Well, it's not fully fleshed out, but ad hoc is a bit of an insult term in philosophical discourse.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to tend to push back against that because I don't think that's been documented.
We certainly don't mean it as an insult in this discourse. I know Brian doesn't either.
Personal, it's a defect of a theory if the principles don't connect. And so one of the reasons that I'm concerned is we've got some lies that seem like they're acceptable, some lies that seem unacceptable. One of the biggest class of lies that seems unacceptable as Catholics is going to be lies about our faith, denials of the faith. And so I'm worried that if we're going to get the right results, it's only because we're adding this unmotivated exception to the general principle.
Except it is motivated. It's motivated by a number of things, including Scripture. And by the way, and this is something we may want to talk about, but the scriptural tradition on lying is way more mixed than y'all presented it in the critique of Janet Smith. But I've presented the overall theory. I've explained from the beginning why I would say certain acts are intrinsically wrong. When asked about that specific category of ones connected with the gospel, I provided 3 different ways of approaching that from within my theory. None of them may have convinced you, and that's fine. But then I would urge you to say, I'm not convinced at this point.
Yeah.
As opposed to
Mhm.
that's ad hoc or unmotivated.
Yeah, and let me say, I don't have a particular deep dog in this fight. I've always leaned towards the traditional view, but it's not been a heavy area of research. And Jimmy, I do think that you have shown that you have resources for your theory here about how to think about this, and then certainly further investigations merit. So I want to strongly acknowledge that. However, I do, and I know we're getting short on time, so we kind of got to pick and choose where we want to finish here. Brian, I think you're probably at least going to want to say something about these hard cases, right? Because you're not going to want to admit that we get the wrong results. Do we want to have you come back and now defend that at all, or do we want to push forward in a different direction? I probably got, honestly, on my end, like 15, 20 more minutes, and I want to just make sure that you both are happy with this general product we're creating here. That makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't think it's worth pressing.
Oh, I'm happy so far.
Yeah. So I think my concerns about the arbitrariness and theoretical, the difficulties of putting all these pieces together in a way that's both cohesive, motivated, and gets us the right results. I think I've explained them well enough to not continue to revisit them. So maybe it'd be
Great.
better to put myself on the ropes for a second. There are hard cases where natural law says, for instance, the person with AIDS can't put on a condom, and they can't. Now,
I don't want to get off into sexual ethics because that's not our topic today.
Yeah, so it's such a cohesive account, and it gives relatively straightforward explanations for lots of actions. So it's going to give really straightforward explanations that are hard about sexual ethics. It's going to give really straightforward recommendations about communication that are hard. People could die based on these results.
Yes.
And so, so trying to put myself on the ropes for a second, I realized that there are going to be some hard cases where I don't think we've got strong, reliable intuitions insofar as we just see that, well, that obviously can't be the case. But I do think that we have strongly emotional hopes to come up with an explanation that can fit what we'd like to do, what we would prefer to do if theory wasn't involved. And in all of these cases, I think our hopes are to come up with a theory that makes life a little bit easier, makes these challenges a little bit less daunting. And I totally understand that. I don't like daunting challenges either. And so why does it matter? Because no matter what, as soon as you get principles, there's going to be ways to test those principles with daunting challenges. And so whether it's a simple explanation, like let's say classical utilitarianism is about as simple as it gets, or you can get some really ridiculous consequences there, or something that's really Byzantine, like I think contractualism is really Byzantine as a moral theory. It doesn't matter. As soon as you get some principles, you're going to have some daunting challenges. And so I guess one thing to say is that natural law is in no worse a position in terms of daunting challenges than other views. It's just a question of when and how they come up. And so I just like to say in sort of like a proactive defense of natural law that, okay.
Well, no, go ahead, and then I'll, because I don't want to interrupt you, and I'll come back.
Okay, so as a proactive defense of this, there are going to be lots of cases where it seems like a lie is so benign, so harmless. What's the problem? A person comes to a false belief. It seems like the world goes on, and they'll eventually come to the truth, and the situation will have passed, so that it seems like life is better that they came to this false belief, and I get that. It's one of the reasons why deception is sometimes permissible. That said, we have the same, I would say, same intuitions about some other mild, harmless actions. So if a terrorist says, slap your daughter, slap her hard, 7-year-old daughter, or I'm going to murder 1 million people by this dirty bomb. It seems kind of harmful, and then it seems kind of harmless. She feels a little bit of pain. Her dad betrayed her in some way.
I'm sorry, forgive me, but I'm having trouble seeing the point you're driving towards.
The point is that a lot of our intuitions about harmless or benign harms, benign momentary harms, a lot of those intuitions are what's driving this lying should be okay in this case and in that case, because it seems so relatively harmless in the context, in the broad scheme of things. What's the big deal?
Okay.
And my
So,
point is, as soon as you introduce that, there's going to be a lot more of these seemingly slightly benign harms, and it's just going to be a matter of degree. It's going to be a Sorites problem.
okay. So you've had a number of points there that have significant plausibility. I mean, it's true that humans have an extraordinary capacity for self-justification, and you've just appealed to a slippery slope. And it's true that people can self-justify themselves on slippery slopes. But the mere fact that is a possibility does not allow you to rationally dismiss a theory like the one I've been proposing, because just because something can be abused does not mean that it doesn't have fundamental utility or that it's fundamentally correct. Also, you've consistently tried to identify your theory with natural law theory. My theory is also natural law theory. You're trying to claim the mantle of all natural law when you're actually advocating a Thomistic Augustinian version of natural law theory. So I would push back a little bit on that and say, hey, my theory is actually a natural law theory as well.
Yeah, I didn't mean to push you out of the tent. This is the view. If you're talking about natural law, most people are going to recognize the view I'm articulating, and that's all I meant by it. But very briefly, I'm not saying that the slippery slope is pushing against your theory. This was a proactive defense of my own theory. The view is that, look, there's this class of intuitions. It's actually bigger than just the lying in difficult situations intuitions. It's a big class of, dang, can I do that? It's going to save a bunch of lives. And, or dang, can I do that? It's going to make life a lot easier. And this big class of intuitions, we're both going to face it.
It's the trolley problem. I mean, it's in another form, but it's essentially the trolley problem.
Difficult choices, problems. And so my point is, look, we're both in the same boat, and every moral theory is in the same boat. It's just that mine is really clear cut because I have bright lines in the sand, as it were, that these are and these are not acceptable. And so it's really easy to articulate where my daunting challenges are, but every theory is going to have them.
And I would agree. However, the fact that one theory gives you simple, clear answers doesn't mean that it's the one that is most configured to reality. It's a theoretic advantage to be able to say, well, here's the answer. We use this theory and it gives us this answer. So that's what we do. And that's a great thing to have in theory, but it doesn't guarantee the right result. And I would say that in the kettlebell murderer scenario, your theory is just going to give the wrong answer. It is much better to tell the guys that his brother is not here than to kill the guy. And so I would say that you need one example to falsify a general theory. And I would say that example falsifies your not you personally. This is not personal.
Yeah, no, I don't think
that it falsifies the theory of lying that you're articulating.
Yeah.
And therefore, we need to look for another. And I think doxastic damage serves admirably in the vast majority of situations.
I don't want to have the last word. That felt like a nice summary of the two views. So if I throw stuff out there, it's just gonna
go ahead. Please.
Yeah, Brian, why don't you say you'll each get one more. Let's just call them closing statements, right? So you can summarize, make one more point. Don't open up a whole new can of worms because I have a date night with my wife, so I do got to get going. Right? And I made a promise. I can't lie to her. I said I'm not going to do this podcast all night, and I think we all agree that would be wrong, right?
Oh well, then we could have a whole other discussion of theory of promises.
Yeah. And I actually have, maybe I could do an individual follow-up episode with each of you, because I just have questions in my own mind that I would have for each of you on both of these. Because like I said, this is an area of active investigation for me as well.
It's your show. You can invite on who you like, but I kind of like the idea of having both sides represented in a discussion, because what I find is if when one person's critiquing another person and they're not there to provide their perspective, I often find that straw men get generated.
Right. Yeah. And so obviously I care very much about fairness, and I consider you both friends, so I wouldn't want that to happen to anybody. I would just be honestly interested in the questions I have, how you would answer them in your respective theory, not reflecting on the other person's theory. So I'll just push it. We'll talk about that off air. Or we could just have a part 2 of this as well. So anyways, all that to say, Brian, why don't you get some closing remarks in? Jimmy, you get some closing remarks. And in your closing remarks, mention some of the projects you're doing, how people can keep up with your work. your podcast, all that sort of stuff. Thank you.
Okay, so Jimmy, I thank you for stimulating conversation, and I think that I'm fascinated. Truthfully, as someone who's really interested in understanding and explaining, rather than proving points, something having alternative views that I can explore that are interesting and new is not because of their novelty bad. I love it, and so I really appreciate you pushing me in favor of this theory. And so I enjoy the back and forth and having something to consider. As someone who feels the force of all the intuitions that you feel, I feel the force of them just the same as you do, and so I'm wrestling epistemically with how I should approach those intuitions. What should I do with them? And so, as a background, stepping aside and just in some ways repeating myself, one of the things that I think about those intuitions is that they have this emotionally driven character. And the emotionally driven character, as I do some psychoanalysis on myself, often has to do with my hope to do something easier, my hope to do something in this way rather than that, because life would be better, broadly construed, if things were to go that way. And that's my emotion. And so I notice when I have some emotions about, especially sexual ethics and lying and things like that, there's a sort of emotional, like, dang, this would be easier on me if I could just figure out how to theoretically tie things together to make that easier life possible within a theory. But then the cognitive side of me kicks in and it says, well, okay, you've got these intuitions, you've got this hope or desire to make things this way and not that. But do they make sense? Can they be rationally constructed, coherently analyzed? And one of the things that I come back to is how natural law, we've confined ourselves in this conversation to natural law's analysis of communication. And that's fine. That's what the topic of discussion is. But one of the things that can be missed, because we're focusing on one tree, is the forest. And the forest is that the view of natural law, and your view can be a view of natural law too. I don't want to be exclusionary, but the view of natural law that I see, classical natural law, Thomistic natural law, has a cohesiveness, a forest that's like a garden. I mean, it works very well together. Now, people can revolt against really slick theories. They can say, it's just too slick. It's too good. We got to find something wrong with it. But the fact of the matter is, with one set of, it's a little bit complicated. It takes me a few weeks to explain to students. But with one set of principles, I can explain everything that there is about morality. There are tricky cases, but we have traction. And one thing that I think is really worth emphasizing here is God would not, I do not believe it would be fitting for God to leave us in the dark without some way of approaching the law written in our hearts, without some way of understanding it that's not too complicated, that's something that simple people could understand, and that people could be able to articulate in time with developments and with revelation. And so, although the simplicity may to some seem excessive, too simple, it gives us the wrong result in these hard cases. I also think that the simplicity is not just theoretically more elegant, it also is more fitting God, who would want a moral theory that everyone could understand. And so I'm not saying your theory isn't like that, but this is one of the reasons why I think simplicity really matters, and why the simplicity of natural law is of great theoretical benefit.
Okay, great. Jimmy, your final thoughts.
Well, I want to thank you, Pat, for having us on for this discussion. I want to thank Brian for a really stimulating conversation, and it's interesting since I'm the one who's proposing the newer theory. It's been interesting being on the hot seat for an hour and a half. Having said, but that's fine. That's what philosophers do, and you got to have a thick skin about these things. Having said that, I recognize a lot of truth in what Brian is saying. At the same time, I would be concerned about out of a desire for simplicity and a desire not to go easy on oneself, getting oneself into a situation in which one has the philosophical equivalent of scrupulosity. Because I end up doing, I've written about scrupulosity on my website, and so I get email from scrupulous people, and they've gotten such a rigid interpretation of a particular law, and they're afraid they're going to be betraying their faith if they relax on that rigid interpretation, and they're unnecessarily worried. Their motive is praiseworthy of, I don't want to sin. And so I want to stay far away from sin, but they're trying to stay so far away from sin and apply a principle so rigidly, they're actually getting the wrong result. And so while it's praiseworthy to say, I don't want to go easy on myself, I don't want to get close to sin, I'd rather err on the side of caution, those are all praiseworthy. But if you don't balance those with a healthy dose of reality, and it's easy, and simplicity is part of the appeal of scrupulosity. I don't have to think about complex calculations and stuff. I just take my principle and use it rigorously. And that's the righteous and holy thing to do, is to be as rigorous as possible with myself, lest I fall into sin and end up on a self-justificatory slippery slope. Well, the problem is scrupulosity is a real condition. We do need to avoid laxism, which is the opposite of scrupulosity, but we also don't want to be scrupulous. We need a healthy dose of reality to help us center in the middle with a robust conscience rather than a defective conscience. And so I appreciate the different concerns that Brian has raised, but to me, they tend in a kind of philosophically scrupulous direction. And it's easier to use a sanity check. To me, it's productive to use a sanity check like the kettlebell killer, where I am more confident that just telling the guy his brother isn't here is better than killing him. I'm more confident of that fact than I am of the particular Thomistic understanding of the fundamental purpose of our communicative faculty, which has multiple different uses.
Right. Excellent. So let me make a few remarks here at the end. First off, thanks to both of you for this extremely stimulating discussion, which I knew it would be. And Jimmy, when I first heard of yours, I was immediately intrigued by it on that brief conversation that you had with Michael Lofton. And I knew that you must have thought very deeply about this. And I agree with your friends that this is something you should publish on. You should you should push that up the priority list and get something written on this. I think it would be really fruitful and helpful. I also want to reiterate that, again, seems like this is within the sort of natural law tent, right? And even though there is this traditional, I guess you can call it hardline Thomistic view, there's many other people under the big tent of natural law who very much would say that their moral perspective is a natural law perspective, even if they have disagreements on certain things. Some other things I might want to explore in future conversations, we could take this up again, are, I think, questions of epistemological messiness, where people can say, yeah, there's a natural law, but we kind of hit an epistemological fog at this level, right? And maybe it's an analysis of powers, what Jimmy is talking about, right? Because that would seem to change things, right? Like if we think that there's a certain limited power here, but the power is actually wider than we think, well, we could see how that would be very, very significant. And the difficulty I've always had with a lot of moral theories are, of course, epistemological ones. At the end of the day, I'm convinced that natural law is correct. I'm less certain of how far we can go with it because of these epistemological issues about how much we can actually know about the natures of things and the dispositions. These are, like I said, open questions for me on a lot of different things. Now, at the same time, I agree with both of you that we have to start with intuitions, right? And I think we still need the best theory is going to be the one that makes the best sense of our best intuitions. Because otherwise we get nowhere, right? If we disregard intuitions, we get nowhere with anything. So it has to start there. But anyway, the wheels are turning from this conversation. They'll probably continue turning all night as I have to go and now
have a date.
Yeah, I have a date with my wife. I'll be talking to her about all this stuff. Anyways, real quick before we sign off, Jimmy, please mention your podcast and any projects you're working up with. This conversation here is one of many kind of recent debates you've had. So just plug anything you want real quick, and then Brian, you can mention anything you're working on before we go as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so folks can check out Catholic.com, which is Catholic Answers, where I work, and we have a podcast there called Catholic Answers Live that I'm on at least once a week. They can also go to my website, jimmyakin.com, and check up on other stuff I'm doing, including my Mysterious World podcast, which comes out with a new mystery every Friday. And you're right about the debates. They kind of piled up on my calendar without me realizing. But in later this month, on March 24th, I am going to be debating Bart Ehrman on the historical reliability of the Gospels. So if you go to Catholic.com, there will be information about that there and how you can watch it either live in person or online.
Yeah, that's going to be a great one. Really looking forward to that. And Brian, anything else you're working on you want to mention before you say goodbye?
I shouldn't have had the last word on this because Jimmy's doing so much more interesting stuff than I am. I'm working on some academic papers on partiality and natural but Jimmy's got more going on than I do. So give him hell. Barter, I mean.
Thank you. I plan to give him hell in the nicest possible way.
Yes, yes, indeed. So, hey, gentle listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Please do, if you like what we're doing here, if you like these conversations, and this what happened here is my goal for this channel when we have conversations. I want to not do anything, so I want to just bring people in that I know can have a respectful, productive conversation. I can listen and enjoy myself and learn. So, I want to thank both of you again for being excellent models in that respect. And I will remind people when we have discussions, debates, or disagreement, that we keep everything respectful. So whatever comments come in afterwards, you can agree, you can disagree, you can offer your opinions. But if I see any trash, it's going in the trash. Simple as that. So let's keep the discourse high. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Love both of the work that you're doing and hope we can continue this again at some point in the future.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Jimmy.